Let's jump right into this explainer. Look, if you think Canada is just this perpetually polite country built entirely on maple syrup, harsh winters, and hockey, well, prepare to have that perspective completely shattered. We're going to uncover the absolutely incredible 11,500-year evolution of the Canadian mosaic. It's this wild, complex story of colliding empires, extreme geographic isolation, rapid economic booms, and a national identity that is, honestly, constantly shifting. Since we're covering a massive geographic expanse and literally thousands of years of history, here's a quick roadmap for us. We'll start with First Nations and explorers, move on to the road to Confederation, then look at the legacy of colonialism, emerging on the global stage, building the multicultural mosaic, and finally, modern challenges and reconciliation. Let's go! Section 1. First Nations and Explorers, the collision of worlds. To really grasp this collision, we've got to go way, way back, long before any European contact. We're talking about the diverse Indigenous nations who built these incredibly complex societies, massive trade networks, and sophisticated self-governing systems right across the continent. Get this, by the early Holocene period, Indigenous North America had a population of maybe 5 million people. That's a huge number. These societies were deeply adapted to some of the most extreme environments on Earth, from nomadic hunters way up in the high Arctic to complex agricultural hubs in the eastern woodlands. So the crucial takeaway here is understanding the sheer violent magnitude of the shift when foreign empires suddenly arrived looking for absolute profit and territorial dominance. The balance of this giant continent was about to be permanently flipped upside down. And this tension, it builds rapidly. The story actually kicks off with some brief Viking settlements around 1000 AD at L'Anse aux Meadows, though they definitely didn't stick around. Fast forward to 1534, Jacques Cartier shows up, plants a cross, and boom, claims the land for France. Soon after, in 1607, the British start founding their own permanent settlements. By 1670, the British charter the Hudson's Bay Company. Now this is mind-blowing. At its peak, this single corporation controlled about 15% of the entire North American landmass. It was just this vast, heavily guarded fur trading empire. Naturally, all this aggressive expansion sparked a massive, fierce rivalry between the French and the British. It essentially wrapped up in 1763 when the British won the 7 Years' War, which, by the way, many historians call the first true global world war, and took over massive chunks of French territory. Section 2. The Road to Confederation, Forging a Dominion. Okay, imagine trying to govern two completely incompatible worlds that are forced to share the exact same piece of real estate. On one hand, you've got the remnants of New France. It's heavily French-speaking, very Catholic, and their economy is anchored in the seigneurial land system, which basically means land is sliced into long, narrow strips along rivers and run by aristocratic lords. Then, right next door, you have the rapidly expanding British North America. They're English-speaking, overwhelmingly Protestant, and they're using sprawling agrarian grid systems run by elected assemblies. Keeping these two totally distinct populations united under one British crown, or honestly just stopping them from tearing each other apart, yeah, it was an absolute administrative nightmare. And by the 1860s, a brand new threat pops up. The post-Civil War United States now has this massive, battle-tested army right to the south, and Canadians are genuinely terrified of being annexed. So, to avoid getting swallowed up by the US, and to fix all that internal political deadlock we just talked about, leaders like John A. Macdonald brokered a massive diplomatic compromise. Enter the British North America Act of 1867. This officially birthed the country. But here's the fascinating part. Unlike the bloody revolutions that built the US or France, Canada was born entirely out of legislation and paperwork. It was this highly decentralized union, a compromise of sweet reasonableness that gave the federal government just enough power to function, but purposely left the provinces with a ton of control over their daily affairs just to keep the peace. Section 3. The Legacy of Colonialism, the Shadows of Nation Building. Now, we have to look objectively at the darker paradox of this era. Because the nation-building of the 19th century was at the very same time an era of tragic, systematic dispossession for Indigenous populations. The Canadian state expanded its reach through some very specific mechanisms. First, traditional land rights were formally extinguished via treaties, which often traded vast, incredibly valuable territories for almost nothing. Then came the imposition of the Indian Act. This was a sweeping piece of legislation that gave the state control over pretty much every aspect of Indigenous lives, literally dictating who legally qualified as an Indian and who was even allowed to leave a reserve. And most devastatingly, they rolled out aggressive forced assimilation policies through the residential school system, which purposefully separated kids from their families to completely obliterate Indigenous cultures, traditions, and languages. Yet, despite decades of intense institutional suppression, Indigenous peoples skillfully navigated these foreign legal systems and absolutely refused to abandon their cultures. And eventually, they secured massive, paradigm-shifting legal victories. See, for centuries, the British-based legal system in Canada only ever recognized written paper deeds as valid proof of land ownership. But the landmark 1997 Dalgamont coup decision changed the game entirely. It literally forced Canadian courts to officially recognize the legitimacy of Indigenous oral traditional law and spoken history. This was a real game changer. It completely rewrote the rules of land rights and Aboriginal title in Canada, proving that Indigenous sovereignty couldn't just be ignored by modern courts anymore. Moving on to Section 4, Emerging on the Global Stage, From Colony to Middle Power. 416,000. That number is just staggering. That is the amount of Canadian volunteers who mobilized to serve overseas in World War I. To put that into perspective, that represented over 30% of the country's entire able-bodied manpower at the time. As the 20th century kicked off, Canada's heavy lifting in these global conflicts really started to forge a unified, autonomous identity, totally separate from Great Britain. The sheer success and the brutal sacrifice of Canadian troops at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917, where all 4 Canadian divisions fought together as one single unit for the very first time, well, historians often point to that exact moment as the true birth of the Canadian nation. It actually earned Canada its own separate independent signature on the Treaty of Versailles. Then, the Second World War transformed the nation even further. It triggered this unbelievable economic explosion. Basically, overnight, Canada shifted from a quiet, agrarian society into a highly urbanized industrial powerhouse. Factories were churning out huge amounts of weapons, vehicles, aircraft, you name it. But crucially, this era also marked a massive financial pivot. Canada fundamentally diversified away from relying on British capital and instead locked into a deep, permanent economic integration with the United States. They linked their supply chains in ways that actually still define the North American economy today. So, with all this newfound economic wealth and military autonomy, Canada started to redefine its global identity. Being a middle power meant Canada was never going to be a sprawling military titan like the US or the Soviet Union. Instead, it carved out a totally different lane as a diplomatic heavyweight and a trusted international referee. A prime example? During the incredibly tense 1956 Suez Crisis, Canadian Foreign Minister Lester B. Pearson pitched the creation of a United Nations emergency force to help de-escalate the conflict. This brilliant maneuver won him the Nobel Peace Prize, and it firmly cemented Canada's modern reputation as a nation totally dedicated to global peacekeeping. Section 5. Building the Multicultural Mosaic, a Changing Society. Meanwhile, back at home, the post-war era and the massive social movements of the 1960s were radically reshaping the nation's internal identity. In 1971, Canada did something truly groundbreaking. It became the very first nation in the world to adopt multiculturalism as an official government policy. To make this simple, just contrast it with the American ideal of the melting pot, where immigrants are generally expected to assimilate into one singular national identity. Canada, on the other hand, went with a mosaic. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau famously said that while Canada has 2 official languages, it has no official culture. The whole idea of the mosaic was to encourage citizens to keep and celebrate their unique cultural heritage while still adding to the broader Canadian picture. And this whole era was supercharged by incredibly active citizens organizing to demand their basic civil liberties. We saw this rapid rise of feminist groups, environmental activists, and powerful labor unions stepping up and fundamentally challenging traditional conservative institutions. For instance, massive advocacy by women's rights groups made absolutely sure that when Canada legally separated its constitution from Great Britain, explicit protections for gender equality were hardwired into the law. This relentless wave of social action led straight to the 1982 passing of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This permanently cemented equal protection and civil liberties for everyone at the absolute highest legal level. Section 6. modern challenges and reconciliation, the ongoing evolution. Today, Canada is caught in this massive friction between its international promises and its domestic economy. On one side of the coin, Canada regularly signs on to major environmental commitments, like ratifying the Kyoto Protocol back in 2002 and the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework in 2015, really projecting the image of a green, climate-conscious nation. But on the flip side, the economic reality tells a very different story. Canada consistently ranks among the highest per capita greenhouse gas emitters in the industrialized world, and that's deeply tied to the immense wealth and employment generated by its resource-heavy industries, especially the massive expansion of the oil sands and pipeline networks. Balancing these deeply conflicting environmental and economic realities is, without a doubt, one of the country's most polarizing modern challenges. On top of that, the incredibly vital process of Indigenous reconciliation remains a distinctly unresolved challenge. The 2008 Truth and Reconciliation Commission spent years investigating the colonial legacy we talked about earlier. They ultimately issued 94 incredibly specific calls to action. Now, these weren't just abstract ideas, they were concrete blueprints for systemic reform across child welfare, the justice system, and education. Yet, as the sources note, collective, systemic action from government bodies and institutions often remains completely stalled. Moving forward is going to require deep, structural legislative changes and real funding, demanding way more than just individual apologies or symbolic acknowledgments. As the sources remind us, all is continually made and unmade. Nations are conspectuses of these involuntary tacts. Man does not so much bequeath history as become it. Ultimately, the biggest thing you should take away from this explainer is that Canada is absolutely not a finished project. It's this continuously shifting, deeply complex mosaic of people, geography, and history. We've traced the timeline all the way from ancient Indigenous settlements through some truly bitter colonial struggles, right up to the birth of a modern multicultural state that's currently facing complex hurdles. So as this nation continues to be made and unmade, what piece of this history are you going to explore next?